In this lecture on public goods and common pool resources, Dr. Simon Levin characterizes collective behavior as a macroscopic pattern that emerges from microscopic interaction. He notes that temporal and spatial challenges of managing common pool resources and draws on ideas of discount rate and externalities to help explain decision-making that erodes these resources. He also highlights the parallels between economic and ecological perspectives on collective action to manage common goods, and identifies cooperation and coercion as concepts in both disciplines that help explain group behavior. Cooperative action to manage public goods in complex adaptive systems at times requires both modularity and polycentricity, and he emphasizes the organizational challenges that uncertainty brings to collective action. He concludes by emphasizing that managing common pool resources is foundational for both human and ecological systems, and that patterns of cooperation and collective action will need to be interconnected and scaled up to address global challenges.
So the title of my talk is Collective Motion, Collective Action, and Collective Decision-Making. Let me get it up on the screen here. Good. And first of all, let me thank the various funding sources, including the ones that are cut off at the bottom. It doesn't look too bad, but especially the National Science Foundation, the Army Research Office, DARPA, but a variety of other agencies that have funded this work in the past. So these are starlings. Except for if the ornithologists are there, you'll see one hawk that's driving this action. I did my PhD in fluid dynamics at Maryland, and it's difficult for a fluid dynamicist to look at this and not see a fluid, not see a lot of individual particles that are moving along using local information, and yet some emergent patterns come out, and not unlike our society. So that's going to be sort of a metaphor for what I'm going to talk about today. My colleague at Princeton, whom I just happened to bump into yesterday, Phil Anderson, wrote a very influential paper in Science nearly 50 years ago called More is Different. Phil is a Nobel laureate in physics, and the message he was trying to get across to physicists is it's not enough to know what all the parts are. Understanding how they're put together and how complex systems become organized requires a different kind of understanding, requires understanding emergent properties. And one of the things that has been pointed out many times over the years, but that ecologists like Martin Scheffer and Steve Carpenter have gotten very interested in recently, is that this emergent behavior can lead to sudden, unexpected, critical transitions. It also leads, and I think a lot of you are working on problems for which this is relevant, inescapably to conflicts between levels of organization. And a lot of the problems that we're dealing with are problems of the commons, problems where individual incentives are not enough in order to assure collective outcomes that are in the global good. So a very good example of a breakdown of or conflict between levels and breakdown of the commons are tumors. And tumors involve cells that proliferate to their own short-term advantage, but ultimately for the harm of the organism. So there's a conflict between the individual cells and what's going on at the macroscopic level. And I'll come back to talk about that because there's a second level of public good that's involved. What are public goods? Public goods problems are widespread, both in socioeconomic settings. So here, I've chosen this slide because it shows not only that fisheries themselves involve common pool resources, which are, as I'll show you in the next slide, I'm going to lump under with public goods, but they're dealing with offshore oil drilling and other activities. So there are conflicts between the usages of public goods and common pool resources. But we also see this in biological systems. When Carol and I were in South Africa, where my student did some research that I'll talk about, she took this picture of a termite mound. A termite mound is a good example of a system in which individuals have to make some effort to build something that's in the collective good at cost to them. So why not cheat on that? So those examples, I hope, show that economic perspective can inform evolutionary investigations, just as an evolutionary perspective, can inform socioeconomic decisions. And so I've chosen two classical works here that I'll come back to talk about later. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, in which he talks about the invisible hand. I'll mention that again at the end, but many of you have probably heard about it. And Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. And there's been an interplay between these two approaches, but Darwin didn't publish this book for about 20 years while he wrestled with altruism. He didn't understand altruism. It didn't fit into his theory of natural selection. And when Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, he was talking about the individuals engaging in actions that ultimately he claimed benefited society, but he recognized that there were conflicts as well. In other words, ecology and economics, it's not surprising the two words start with the same syllable, because they really are two sides of the same coin. Ecological systems are, after all, economic systems, or economic systems are ecological systems in that there's competition for resources, there's exploitation, there's cooperation, there are emergent flows and networks. So they're really two examples of the same thing. So when we compare these two systems, we're not just talking about analogies, we're talking about two systems that have similar structures. So let me go back to the breakdown of public goods in tumor cells. But it also turns out there's a second level here, as I mentioned. Tumor cells produce a number of compounds like cytokines that are crucial for the growth of the tumor. So with three colleagues, David Dingley, who's a distinguished oncologist at the Mayo Clinic, George Pacheco, who's a game theorist in Portugal, and Karina Tarnita, my colleague at Princeton, we've been interested in whether we can use game theoretic techniques to understand how to undercut the production of the cytokines, which are a public good. If David has managed to engineer cells that are like tumor cells but do not produce these cytokines and other compounds, if we can figure out how to get them to proliferate, then that might be a way to undercut the tumor growth. So we have three levels. We have the tumor cells producing a public good, but at the same time undercutting the public good at the next level up. This is not a completely new idea. John Pepper wrote this article some years ago talking about dealing with pathogen public goods, targeting them to try to undercut the success of a pathogen or of tumors. So problems of public goods and common pool resources, and I'll soon start just lumping those together, are central to the sorts of issues that are being confronted at SUCCINC. We are eroding our public goods. I've just chosen a sample here to show that. This is taken from, or this is essentially a cartoon from Beijing showing the degree to which pollution has increased. Air pollution, or I should say air quality, good air quality is a public good, but individuals don't have sufficient incentives to stop their polluting behaviors. We discount the future. You see this picture that Carol took of me not too long ago. You know you shouldn't eat it, but it looks good. And we discount the interests of others. This hasn't happened yet, but you've probably heard about the rumors about allowing cell phone use on telephones. Anybody who rides the train back to New York and doesn't sit in the quiet car knows what it's like to sit next to somebody talking on the phone for 3 hours. Imagine flying to Beijing with someone talking. The problem is we live in a global commons in which individual agents act largely in their own self-interest, and the social costs are not adequately accounted for. And by the way, just to make clear the difference between what are called in economics public goods and common pool resources, these both refer to to things that everybody needs and everybody has an interest in maintaining, but that maybe there isn't sufficient individual incentive to it. The difference between a public good and a common pool resource is a public good means that if I use it, it doesn't affect your ability to use it. I can't exclude you, it's non-rivalrous. So clean air would be an example of that. Whereas a fishery is generally called a common pool resource, because if I take fish out of the ocean, they're not there for you to use. But as you can imagine, there's a whole continuum along that spectrum, and often common pool resources are referred to as public goods with congestion, and so I'm just going to use the term public goods from now on. So the problem, of course, are free riders. The free riding cells in the tumors, but in all of the situations I'm going to talk about, it's like this fellow riding the rails here, individuals who benefit from what others are producing or protecting, but don't pay the price of doing so. Overuse of the commons was suggested 2 centuries ago by William Forster Lloyd, when he talked about the commons as, in terms of grazing grounds, as places that everybody shared. But it really became well known in the middle of the last century when Garrett Hardin wrote his famous paper on the tragedy of the commons. And if you could read at the top, what it says is the tragedy of the unregulated commons, because Garrett Hardin's solution was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, but what he really meant is government action to laws that would protect the commons. But Elinor Ostrom, late great Nobel laureate and colleague, showed that in small-scale fisheries, for example, these communities developed their own norms, their own ways of regulating public goods, so it was very much a bottom-up solution, didn't require government regulation. I'll come back and talk about that later. So in trying to approach this question, I've been involved with a group through the Bayer Institute in Sweden that brings together ecologists and economists. We publish a paper about once a year. Kenneth Arrow is perhaps the greatest economist of all time. He's certainly one of the greatest, and he's still alive and he's still productive, about to turn 95. And we wrote a paper as part of this group a few years ago called, and you'll recognize a number of the names on that paper, I'm sure, Are We Consuming Too Much?, in which we attempted to make a computation of that would be a basis for sustainability that took into account what individuals consume, but tried to take into account natural capital at the same time. And I'm not going to take you through that. I'm happy to refer you to the paper and to the literature that's followed upon it. But basically the idea is as follows. You can compute for society, or for a particular society, the intertemporal social welfare, which is the integral, in other words, the sum over all future times, from t to infinity, of the consumption that society is utilizing at a particular time, converted into the utility to society, and this is where the natural capital would come in, and then discounted according to how far into the future you're realizing these benefits. So e to the minus delta s minus t, where delta is the discount rate, how much you care about the future relative to what you care about today. So this is the formula. Of course, the real story is in how you measure these things, and for that I refer you to the paper. So these are the key terms. How do you measure utility, and what discount rate should you use? The choice of discount rate is really crucial in any of these analyses, and there is not agreement on what discount rate to use. For example, an argument could be made, and has been made, to use a zero discount rate, meaning you want to leave for the future the same as we have today. But think about what happens if you're dealing with a non-renewable resource and a zero discount rate, and you want to leave for the future as much as today. It means you can't use any, in order that future generations also can't use any, because they'd have to make the same computation. You could also make an argument for a negative discount rate if you take into account that there are likely to be more people in the future and you want to leave more per capita. So this is a problem. So in general, you have to justify some sort of a discount rate if you're going to utilize anything based on uncertainty about the future, or the as we do in our formula, the potential for technological solutions to provide alternatives. One of the most famous usage of discount rates is in Nick Stern's report on the economics of climate change, in which he emphasized the importance of doing something. He's one of the leading economists in the UK, but there's a lot of argument, a lot of debate about how he came to the discount rates he used of somewhere between 1% and 2%. The world distribution of wealth is growing more distorted. This picture is very dramatic, the champagne glass in which, but you all know this information, in which a small percentage of individuals have a disproportionate percentage of the wealth, and the inequity is actually growing. Ken Arrow, the same Ken Arrow I mentioned before, and I got interested in the question of how much should individuals be leaving for future generations. I got interested in this for a couple of reasons. There's an obvious strong parallel between the question economists asked, which is how much should you consume now? How much should you leave for your old age? How much should you leave for your children? And all of life history theory about how much should a plant invest in growth versus reproduction, and how should it utilize resources over its lifetime. So this paper explores that interplay between evolutionary life history theory and what's called dynasty theory in the face of uncertainty. One of the things that comes out of this model, the idea of looking at this was to try to find out, just based on an optimization approach, actually dynamic programming, how much should individuals consume now, how much should they leave for their children? Of course, it depends on how they value their children relative to themselves. And this theory also needs to be modified to take into account prosociality, about which I'll talk later, namely how much do you care about other individuals. But once you have the answer to that question of how much individuals are going to leave to future generations, you have a dynamic model that tells you how wealth is going to be distributed. And that's the part that Ken got most excited about, because what it tells you is that there will be inequality in the distribution of wealth, and that it will grow. And the higher your uncertainty, the faster it will grow. Indeed, our model predicts a log normal distribution, which isn't quite right, of the distribution of wealth, with a variance that grows depending on uncertainty. In fact, what the distribution should look like is a little bit more like this, with a long tail out to the right. Rich people have even more than the log normal distribution would tell you. And so we've been looking at a number of elaborations of this, trying to produce that so-called Pareto tail, that parallel tail. And our favorite explanation now that Sarah Drohan, a student of mine, is exploring, is taking into account the fact that wealthy people not only have more money, but they get a higher return on their investment. I just saw on the Princeton webpage that Princeton got something like a 20% return on its investment last year. I can't do that, and they won't let me invest with them. But it's because there are a number of advantages. You can invest in different things and in different ways when you have more. Ecosystems in the biosphere are complex adaptive systems. That means they are made up of individual agents that interact with each other on local scales. There are emergent properties, like with the bird flocks, like in the tumor cells, that play out on larger levels. Those emergent properties feed back to affect individual behaviors. So these are what we call complex adaptive systems. It means that the individual parts of the system adapt. It doesn't mean that the system is adapting for its own good necessarily. And there are a lot of challenges in managing these systems. Arrow and I, together with Paul Ehrlich, published a paper last year on the challenges in managing complex adaptive systems. One of them is processors are playing out on multiple spatial and temporal and organizational scales. So from a modeling point of view, that's a great challenge. Systems self-organize, and that means they're emergent properties. And that leads to a lot of unpredictability because there may be multiple pathways. Things can follow multiple stable states, path dependence, hysteresis, meaning, for example, in the case of the shallow lakes, if you overload them with phosphorus and they go from oligotrophic to eutrophic, and then you start reducing phosphorus, they don't go right back the way you'd like them to. And the potential for contagious spread and systemic risk. And that can lead, and you'll hear about this probably from Steve Carpenter later in the week, for the potential of the system to become destabilized either because of external changes like climate change or simply the gradual erosion embedded in hidden variables like biological diversity that's removing some of the buffering the system has. So there's the potential, that's what we call slow time scale evolution, the potential for regime shifts. In 2008, well actually in 2006, I went to a meeting sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences and the New York Fed, funded by Timothy Geithner, who later became the Secretary of the Treasury. It was called Systemic Risk in Banking Systems. And George Sugihara at Scripps went there with me, and afterwards we set out to write this paper together with Bob May, and it came out in 2008 in Nature. It's called Ecology for Bankers. And what we said is this meeting was eye-opening for us. We're just humble ecologists, but when we look at the interconnectedness of the banking system, we are reminded of highly interconnected food web structures, and a lot of theory tells us that those interconnected systems are prone to collapse. So we'd worry a little bit, we say, about this. We said, who knows, for example, how this present concern over subprime loans will pan out. Well, this was 6 months before Lehman Brothers and 6 months before the markets collapsed. I wish I had read this paper and not just written it. The point is that complex systems have the potential to have tipping points, have thresholds, have the potential for sudden change. Not just banking systems, of course, but there's been a lot of interest recently. We have a paper that's just come out in Critical Care Medicine with Martin Skeffer in the lead on that, on signals in physiological systems. Are there signals in EKGs and EEGs that will tell you you're about to go into atrial fibrillation, you're about to have a migraine headache, you're about to have an epileptic seizure? That's what physicians look for, are these sorts of signals. So are there early warning signals? And there's been a lot of interest in that area recently. One potential critical transition that I've been involved with is work with my student Carla Staver. And it starts, and Sally Archibald in South Africa, and it starts with this diagram that'll be familiar to all of the ecologists, or some version of it, which tells you that if you know what the average temperature and the average precipitation are in a particular region, you can make a pretty good prediction about what kind of vegetation will be there, where you'll have tropical rainforest, where you'll have tundra, etc. You won't know exactly which species will be there. In the face of climate change, you can't just say Maryland's going to have the same climate in 50 years that southern Spain has, and therefore you'll have the same species. There'll be species with similar characteristics, but a lot will depend on the spatial movement of species. But even within some of these zones, there's unpredictability. And so Carla and Sally went to the MODIS data sets and mapped where one found savanna and where one found forests in similar areas. And there are areas on the globe where one predicts that there should be savanna, that is grassland, and there is. And there are areas where one predicts that there ought to be forest deterministically, and there is. But then there are these areas in between, and we're working on explicitly spatial models now because obviously there's an edge effect, where there's a bistability, where the system could be sustained as forest and could be sustained as grassland, but it's somewhat unpredictable which. And following ideas of William Bond, we think that a major factor explaining this is fire. The idea, and here you can see that that fire really does separate the zones where you get grassland from where you get forest. The idea is that grass burns, but it doesn't kill the grass plant. The grass regrows, but that fire prevents the saplings from advancing to become adult trees. So as long as you can keep the system burning, grass is preserved. And in fact, grass has adaptations to allow it to burn because it allows it to maintain itself that way. Once the trees escape in size, having been protected from fire for a while, you establish a forest-dominated system. So it's a bistable system. And it's a bistable system that's fairly easily modeled. So we've looked at and continue to look at some more complex versions of this. But this is these are the guts of the model we looked at. I'll talk about more in my lightning talk, more of the detail, but I'll just go through this. The idea is we divide up the land into grass, saplings, and savanna trees, and look at the transition rates from one state to another. And the most important rate along here is the rate at which saplings advance to become trees, and that's this function omega of g times s. So that's savanna area. This is the rate, and the idea is the rate that that saplings become trees depends on how much grass there is in the system, and it depends on how much grass there is in the system because it depends on the probability of fire occurring. And the transition rate we use, and we derive this from a percolation model of forest fire spread, shows a rather steep threshold where there's a sudden shift from a very high probability of fire to a very low probability of fire, going back the other way. High probability of fire would allow high levels of grass to be maintained, or let me put it the other way, if you have high levels of grass, you have a high probability of fire occurring, and therefore a low transition rate of the saplings to become trees. So when we analyze this model, what we find is there are two stable states in the system, at least at intermediate levels of precipitation. At high levels of precipitation, no fires, saplings advance to trees. At low levels of precipitation, lots of fires, and the saplings never advance to trees. But in the middle, there are two stable states, and so there's the potential, if the system flips up into here, that it becomes sustained. There's also the potential as the precipitation level changes for the system to move close to that threshold point, so the system to lose its stability, and at that point, we could see the dramatic changes in grassland. So our conclusions are, if there are changes in climate change in rainfall status, there are going to be rapid threshold transitions. They won't be easy to reverse. That's the hysteretic effect. And as Martin Skeffer and Steve Carpenter and others have pointed out, there are similar phenomena in many other systems. They've worked on shallow lakes. Buzz Holling worked on the spruce budworm. Pest populations obviously can go into outbreak. I was just reading about Zika this morning too, as the mosquito populations are increasing their range. And of course, people have been long worried about changes in the global circulation patterns. Martin has led a revolution in thinking about these systems. This is one paper we published in Nature asking about some of the early warning signals of critical transitions. Martin in particular has emphasized what's called critical slowing down. The rate at which the system relaxes to its equilibrium is getting less and less. The system in some sense is less stable, and that's an early warning indicator. But I don't want to say any more about it at this time. I've talked about critical transitions. I want to go on now to talk about public goods and conflict and collective action. So I talked about tumors at the beginning as one example of public goods. I'm going to talk about collective motion in collective motion, some individuals are finding out information and others are stealing that information. Information itself is perhaps the ultimate public good. Those of you who are behavioral ecologists, you'll know about the conflict between producers and scavengers. Microorganisms in the ocean produce siderophores that chelate iron and other materials to make it available for later use, but those are floating around out there, and I could come by and steal your chelated iron. That's a public good. Plants fix nitrogen. That's costly, but they drop their leaves, and if I'm the plant next to you and you're fixing nitrogen, why don't I just steal your nitrogen? Classical public goods problem that we have been looking at with Lars Hedin and a number of students, Duncan Mengi and others, for a number of years. Plants produce antibiotics. Those are costly to produce, and this protects the plant. But if people have, Bruce Levin and Lynn Chow have demonstrated in experiments that cheaters can arise that don't produce the antibiotic but simply become resistant to it. And so how do you sustain antibiotic production? And by the way, antibiotics, as you know, are in a quite different way a public goods problem in that we are eroding the effectiveness of our antibiotics by overuse of them. So antibiotics and human societies, antibiotics and vaccines present public goods problems. And bacteria produce extracellular polymers that are cues for quorum sensing and also provide a matrix for growth. With my student, Carrie Nadell, and others, we looked at this from a modeling framework and said, let's look at competition between or three different kinds of genotypes, those that, four different kinds. It's hard with those high numbers. Ones that never produce the extracellular polymers, ones that always produce the extracellular polymers, ones that only produce them at high densities, that's like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and those that only produce them at low numbers. Vibrio cholera is an example of that. So what selects for these different strategies? So the simulation you just saw is a simulation of the growth of a biofilm on a spatial grid. Space is extremely important in these considerations, in which the nutrient is being provided from above, and which the cells of different types are growing on top of each other, and asking under what conditions, under which rates one would select for the different sorts of cells. I have to go back to the dentist on Friday because of these guys, because of the biofilms, which are in your mouth, certainly in mine, are many different species of bacteria that form biofilms, and with lots of public goods floating around. How do we do this in society? In society, collective action depends often on insurance agreements, which spread the risks. So with Dan Rubenstein and Avinash Dixit, Dan's a behavioral ecologist, and Avinash is a leading economist at Princeton. We looked at the sharing of grazing grounds. This is all part of a broader program I'll talk about this afternoon that Dixit and I have. Sharing of grazing grounds among East African herdsmen. So the idea is that I'm a herdsman in East Africa, and it's really a bad climate year for me, or bad. And I turned to Margaret and I said, "Can I send my cattle over to graze on your land?" And she, putting aside her general good intention, says to me, "Why should I do that?" And I say, "Well, because next year the situation may be reversed, and you should, you could send your cattle back to graze on my land, and this could happen. It's just chance." So she sits down to make a calculation as to whether she should do it. And I will talk more about that later, but when she makes that calculation, she has to take into account her discount rate, how much she cares about next year relative to this year. So I will talk this afternoon about the mathematics of this a little bit. One of the things that's important is a lot of these societies are kin or friends, and so then Margaret says, "Okay, I'll do it for you," because And so that has to be taken into the calculation. So prosociality can be very important. But societies in general develop also social norms, rules by which they govern behavior. This is a game I play with my class all the time, and it works beautifully, but it comes from an experiment by Ernst Fair, in which he takes a room of this sort and he gives everybody in the room a certain number of resources, which they can either spend on themselves, or they can contribute to some public pool, or if they choose, at cost to themselves, they can use them to punish some other individuals. So I play a game like this in the class. Everybody's got a price by which they're willing to punish people who have violated their sense of fairness. So their sense of society. And it's interesting, experiments have been done, especially by Joe Heinrich and others, and it varies a great deal among societies what people will do, and that game's called the ultimatum game. So in this game is played multiple times. This is not exactly the ultimatum game. And initially, individuals are a little bit selfish. When I play this game in class, there are always some individuals who do each of the three strategies. So initially, individuals are selfish, and then individuals start punishing. Usually they punish the non-cooperators, but sometimes, just for the hell of it, they punish the cooperators. It's like an honor system. Individuals will pay a price to punish others who deviate from social norm, even if it costs them. And punishment itself becomes a norm that can evolve from repeated interactions. So to understand pro-social behavior and cooperation in societies, we really have to understand norms. And of course, eventually, these norms that arose become formalized into laws, things that you're not allowed to do in society, like steal. So with two former students, Maya Schluter was a postdoc and Alessandro Tovoni was a visiting student. We're still working together. Maya's at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and Alessandro's at the London School of Economics. We looked at fairness norms. Again, I'll talk more about this afternoon, but the idea that individuals will ostracize, can agree, they're withdrawing something from a common pool resource, whether it's water or fish, and they find out what would be optimum for society, and they agree, some subset agree to that, but others withdraw at a higher level, but those who withdraw at a lower level ostracize or punish in some way those. And the question is, under what conditions can this be sustained? Much easier to do, of course, in small societies. So far I've talked about collective action and showed, I hope, that it can be effective if it includes enforcement. Argued that pro-sociality, caring about others, is important. And in the final section, I want to talk about how collective decisions are made. So first of all, there's a whole mathematical theory of voting that I'm not going to talk about. But with Ian Cousin, former postdoc and colleague, now director of a Max Planck Institute, and a number of other colleagues, we published a paper in 2011. We called them uninformed. I wish we had said unopinionated because it led to some misunderstanding. But what we showed is that society is made up of some individuals with strong opinions one way or another, and a lot of individuals who just look to others for their leadership. Just look what's going on in the presidential primaries. And so this goes back to the comparison between collective behavior in bird flocks and fish schools and collective behavior in human societies. So in that paper, we looked at building on an earlier models that I'll show you that we published in 2005, individual-based models of fish schools, experiments that Ian did with fish schools, and models that we developed borrowing from the socioeconomic literature on decision-making in human societies. So let me just tell you a little bit about the models of fish schools. In the models of fish schools, the fish haven't arrived yet here, every individual is allowed to either follow her own plans about where to move, which may be based about information about the environment, but there's nothing in this model that says it's the right way to go. and individuals who also follow others. So in the first video I'm going to show you here, there are 100 individuals, only one of whom knows where to go, which is up there. The other 99 of whom are just followers. But even the individual who knows where he wants to go, she wants to go, is pulled back into the group. So what you'll see happens is that white dot, the knowledgeable individual, tries to move up in this direction, but can't convince anybody else to go along. But if it goes out and recruits 4 friends, and in the next video, there are 5 individuals who know where to go, and they eventually get together, find their way to the front, and to begin to move up to the goal. And then they go out and recruit 5 more individuals. So now there are 10 leaders, and the group moves rather predictably and rapidly up to the goal. So we looked at this for a number of group sizes and varying the number of leaders. And these are, at the top, you see larger groups. And you can see that this curve goes up. This is how fast they move towards the goal. It's probably more informative to look at the actual number, independent of group size, and then you can see the result is almost independent of group size. As soon as you have 5 or 10 leaders, the group moves about as efficiently as it can up towards its goal. So animal societies can be led by a very small number of individuals. But what if 5 individuals want to go here and 5 want to go there? The group's got to either come to consensus, or it's going to split or oscillate back and forth. And we see all 3 cases of that. And so we set out through more detailed mathematical models to look at the importance. We now have 3 groups. We have some individuals that want to go here, some that want to go here, and the vast majority that are unopinionated and simply follow their nearest neighbors. And we varied also the strength of commitment, and Ian can do this experimentally, to the 2 targets. And what we find in all this, if you're going to get consensus, it's very crucial to have these unopinionated individuals. They provide the glue that prevents the population from splitting apart, and they provide the momentum that suddenly can shift from one to the other. Look what just happened in terms of flying the Confederate flag in South Carolina, a sudden shift in attitude. Look what happened some years ago in terms of foot binding in China, a practice that was sustained over long periods of time. Sudden shift. How do we understand those sudden shifts? Attitudes towards gender equality, racial equality, etc. All of these are examples where there were strongly embedded norms that suddenly shifted. If we could understand that, we could also understand perhaps how attitudes towards environmental action change. So we investigated this from multiple angles, as I said, those experimental studies that Ian does, the simulation of these fish populations and analysis of that, models of human decision-making that we use, and all of them in this paper and in work we've done since. So attitudinal shifts can affect actions on issues like climate change. And this may involve only a few leaders. This is both depressing and encouraging because it means that there is the potential for change. Most individuals constrained by bounded rationality don't have confidence to make their own decisions, and they look to leaders and others, and so there can be sudden shifts in behavior. And these are given momentum by the fact that there are these large number of followers. So the argument is we have to take that into account in dealing with environmental action. So I want to conclude with a few comments. Can the cooperation in these small societies that ostracism, or Lynn Ostrom's, I guess it should be called ostracism, I never learned, talks about, can they be extended to the global level? Going back to Adam Smith, which is where I started, Adam Smith said by pursuing his own interest, he, the baker, frequently promotes the interests of society more effectively than if he actually meant to. But even Adam Smith recognized that this also led to the potential for exploitation. And we learned, if we didn't know it before, in 2008 when the markets collapsed, that the invisible hand does not protect society. Similarly, when Margaret and I were children, people talked about Gaia, the goddess Gaia, that was going to protect society. The earth was here for people, and it would adjust. But we know that's not the case. We know that these systems, these complex adaptive systems, have their own self-organizing properties, but that we need a balance between bottom-up and top-down approaches. And working towards extending Lynn's approach to the global level, we've been inspired to build on her idea of polycentricity, which is based on the existence of a modular structure, the idea that you get agreements in small groups, and then you use those as building blocks. This is actually, the idea is that group structure creates modules for better cooperation, and one of Lynn's last arguments is that this was the way to deal with climate change. This is an idea that goes back to the great economist Herbert Simon, who talked about two different watchmakers, one of whom makes watches from beginning to end, nonstop, and the other of whom makes little modules and puts them on the shelf. And at the end, then assembles them into watches. They both keep getting interrupted, and this fella has to keep starting over again every time, whereas this guy just takes the various modules he has and puts them together. And so each time he only has to, the worst he'll do is to lose the module he's working on. It's like saving your work when you're working on a word processor. And also, in evolution, we've learned that modular structures, both phenotypically and genotypically, arise that create building blocks that accelerate the speed of evolution. An interesting question is, therefore, do systems actually evolve their own modularity, not just through, under evolutionary forces, but in our societies? My colleague, Anthony Appiah, talked about the fact that groups that historically have been in close contact with each other are much more likely to also engage in hostile actions against each other, because they have to develop boundaries in order to preserve their own identities. And so the ethics of identity actually can lead to conflicts, whereas groups that have never been in contact with each other don't tend to be in conflict. In molecular biology, in cell biology, there's a lot of interest in how modular structures have been selected for over time because of all these features. This afternoon, I'll talk a little bit about work with Avinash Dixit, in which we look at a modular structure of the system and ask under what conditions we can get individuals to contribute to public goods. Lynn Ostrom, as I said, talked about this for climate change, and Bill Nordhaus, another leading economist, comes at it from a different approach, what he calls climate clubs, which is an idea that I've explored with Phil Hannum and Vitor Vasconcelos. This has impressed, I think it's actually come out now, and with George Pacheco, whom I mentioned at the beginning. And I won't have time to go into detail on this, but the idea is that nations belong to clubs. NATO would be a club. The United Nations would be a club. And nations belong to multiple overlapping clubs. And within those clubs, individual nations can get together and reach an agreement, say, on climate change, on mitigating climate change. So there's a three-level structure. Individuals can either be outsiders or they can become members of these clubs. But these clubs are overlapping, that's important. And within them, there may be cooperators. And the deeper in you are, the more you pay, but the more your benefits. So I won't, I may have time this afternoon to talk about that. But what we show is that this can lead to agreements and to the maintenance of public goods. So just to conclude, managing the commons is both an environmental and an evolutionary challenge. In human societies, and I skipped over that there, mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, originally suggested by Garrett Hardin, but really given meat by Lynn Ostrom's work. Users self-organize in order to develop norms and institutions, to design sanctions et cetera, and to maintain cooperation. Ecological systems and socioeconomic systems both are complex adaptive systems with individual agents pursuing their own agendas, and where we're going to need the interplay between top-down mechanisms and bottom-up mechanisms. So we need some regulation, but we don't need an over-regulated system. But this is going to be crucial to the management of public goods. How do we go from self-organization to international agreements? Public goods problems and common pool resource problems are fundamental challenges. They're, I'm sure, crucial to half the projects that are going on here. Collective action can emerge from local interactions, and things play out on multiple scales. Can cooperation be extended to the global level? Well, the trouble is that, and as I showed you with Anthony Appiah's book, often in evolutionary theory, the reason cooperation has emerged is to help groups in conflict with other groups. We're going to have to recognize that there is no other in this case. As Pogo pointed out, we have met the enemy and he is us. We're going to have to recognize that in order to achieve sustainability, we're going to have to recognize we have a common enemy, and it's environmental degradation. And different types of us are going to have to cooperate together in order that we can achieve a sustainable future for our children and our grandchildren. Thanks very much.